Sometimes the family we need most walks up to our door when we least expect it. Sometimes it comes in the form of a lost child, asking for just one night of shelter. Judson Tate had been alone on his ranch for 5 years since losing his wife and son. The townspeople called him a ghost, and he lived like one. Then a 10-year-old boy appeared at his door, dusty and scared. "My father left me today," the child whispered. "May I stay one night, sir?" Judson looked into those hopeful eyes and said the words that changed everything. "You can stay forever." The boy brought life back to the ranch and laughter back to Judson's heart. But when a stranger arrived claiming the boy belonged elsewhere, Judson faced the fight of his life. Can love prove stronger than law when it comes to protecting the family you choose? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Cedar Mesa in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the sprawling ranch that Judson Tate had called home for the better part of 2 decades. From his kitchen window, he could see the cattle scattered across the eastern pasture like dark punctuation marks against the golden grass. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional juniper tree and the distant purple outline of the San Juan Mountains. It was beautiful country, the kind that made a man feel both significant and insignificant all at once. Judson had fallen in love with this place the moment he'd first laid eyes on it, fresh out of the army and looking for something permanent to build his life around. That was 23 years ago, when he was young and full of dreams about raising a family in this vast, peaceful corner of Utah. Now, at 51, those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Judson poured himself a cup of coffee from the dented pot on the stove, the same pot Emma had bought at a yard sale in Moab during their first year of marriage. Everything in the house carried memories like that, small, everyday reminders of the life he'd built and lost. The wooden kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals. The rocking chair by the fireplace where Emma had nursed their son, Tommy. The hand-carved toy chest that still sat in what had been Tommy's room, though Judson hadn't opened that door in over a year. The fire had happened on a Tuesday in November, 5 years and 7 months ago. Judson had been out checking fence lines in the north pasture when he saw the smoke rising from the direction of the house. By the time he rode back, the volunteer fire department from town was already there, but it was too late. The old farmhouse had gone up like kindling, taking with it everything that had made his life worth living. The insurance money had been enough to rebuild, and Judson had thrown himself into the work with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his grief. The new house was larger and more modern than the old one, with better insulation and a more efficient heating system. It was a fine house by any measure, but it had never felt like home. How could it, when the laughter that had once filled these rooms was gone forever? In the years since, Judson had settled into a routine that kept him moving from dawn to dusk. He rose before sunrise, tended to the cattle, mended fences, maintained equipment, and handled the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. He spoke to the animals more than he spoke to people, finding comfort in their uncomplicated presence. The cattle didn't ask questions or offer condolences. They simply existed, requiring care and attention, giving him a reason to get out of bed each morning. The people in Cedar Bluff, the nearest town 15 miles to the south, had tried to help in the beginning. Church ladies brought casseroles and offers of companionship. Neighbors stopped by to check on him and offer assistance with ranch work. But Judson had gradually withdrawn from all of it, politely but firmly declining invitations and discouraging visitors. Eventually, folks got the message and left him alone. That was how he'd earned the nickname, the Ghost of Tate Ranch. He heard it sometimes when he made his monthly trips to town for supplies, whispered behind hands in the checkout line at Miller's Feed and Hardware. The children would peer at him from behind their mother's skirts, wide-eyed and curious about the tall, silent man with the weathered face and the haunted look in his grey eyes. Judson didn't mind the nickname. In many ways, it felt accurate. He was haunting his own life, moving through the motions of living without ever feeling truly alive. The man who had laughed easily and loved deeply was buried in the same cemetery as his wife and son, leaving behind only this hollow shell that looked like him and answered to his name. The ranch itself reflected his emotional state. Where once there had been Emma's flower garden beside the front porch, now there was only prairie grass and weeds. The swing set Tommy had played on was long gone, sold to a young family in town who had children of their own. The vegetable garden that had provided fresh produce for their table had been ploughed under and seeded with alfalfa. Anything that spoke of family life, of joy and hope and future plans had been systematically removed or allowed to decay. What remained was functional but stark. The barn was well maintained, the fencing was in good repair, and the cattle were healthy and well fed. Judson took pride in his work, even if he took no pleasure in it. The ranch turned a modest profit each year, enough to keep him comfortable and independent. But comfort and independence were poor substitutes for the warmth of human connection. His closest neighbor was old Pete Hannigan, whose property bordered Judson's to the west. Pete was in his 70s now, a widower himself, who understood the particular weight of grief that came with outliving those you loved most. Occasionally, Pete would ride over to share a cup of coffee and talk about cattle prices or weather patterns. These visits were the closest thing Judson had to friendship, though neither man would have used that word to describe their relationship. The days blended into one another with a sameness that Judson found both comforting and numbing. He rose at 5, checked the cattle, returned to the house for breakfast, then spent the morning working on whatever project demanded his attention. Afternoons were for paperwork and planning, evenings for a simple dinner and an hour of reading before bed. He read voraciously history, biography, the occasional novel, anything that would occupy his mind and keep it from wandering into painful territory. It was a life stripped down to its essential elements, like a tree that had lost all its leaves but continued to stand. There was a certain dignity in it, perhaps even a kind of nobility in his determination to keep going despite everything he had lost. But it was also a life half-lived, an existence that functioned without flourishing. On this particular evening in late September, as autumn painted the mesa in shades of gold and crimson, Judson followed his usual routine. He'd finished the evening feeding and was walking back to the house when he noticed something unusual. A small figure was moving along the dirt road that led to his property, still perhaps a quarter-mile away but clearly heading in his direction. Visitors were rare enough that any approaching figure warranted attention. As the figure drew closer, Judson could see it was a childer boy, by the look of him, walking with the determined gait of someone who had been traveling for a long time. The sight stirred something in Judson's chest, a mixture of curiosity and concern that he hadn't felt in years. He stood on his front porch, one hand resting on the wooden railing that Emma had insisted on painting white, and waited. The boy was small, probably no more than 10 years old, with dark hair and clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He carried what appeared to be a leather satchel slung over one thin shoulder, and his steps were beginning to falter as exhaustion took its toll. As the child drew near enough for Judson to make out his features, he felt a strange sensation in his chest, not quite recognition, but something deeper and more primal. The boy's face was streaked with dust and tears, and his eyes held a mixture of hope and desperation that reminded Judson of a lost colt he'd once found wandering the mesa, separated from its mother and nearly wild with fear. The boy stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Judson with those remarkable eyes brown with flecks of gold that caught the last rays of the setting sun. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and careful assessment. Then the boy took a small step forward, clutching his satchel tighter against his chest, and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper but carried clearly in the still evening air. "My father left me today," he said, and Judson felt something crack open inside his chest, like ice breaking up on a winter pond. "May I stay one night, sir?" The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, drifting and settling into the quiet spaces of Judson's carefully ordered world. He stared down at the boy, taking in the details that spoke of a story he didn't yet understand. The child's clothes were good quality, but wrinkled and dusty, as if he'd been sleeping rough. His brown hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and there were tear tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "Your father left you?" Judson asked, his voice rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another person in nearly a week, and the words felt strange in his throat. The boy nodded, a quick, sharp movement that spoke of barely controlled emotion. "He said he couldn't take care of me anymore. He put me on the bus in Denver and told me to get off when I saw pretty country." The child's voice was steadier now, but Judson could hear the effort it cost him. "I've been walking since yesterday morning." Judson's chest tightened. Denver was more than 300 miles away. The boy had somehow made it to this remote corner of Utah with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever was in that worn leather satchel. The satchel itself was an interesting detail-old but well-made, the kind of thing that spoke of better circumstances than the boy's current situation suggested. "What's your name, son?" Judson asked, though something in his heart already knew this conversation was going to change everything. "Noah," the boy replied. "Noah Mitchell." He looked up at Judson with those remarkable eyes, and there was something in them that reminded Judson painfully of Tominot in appearance, but in that particular combination of vulnerability and resilience that children carried when they were trying to be braver than they felt. "I'm Judson Tate," he said, then paused, unsure of what came next. He'd been alone for so long that the social protocols felt foreign. "Are you hungry, Noah?" The boy's nod was immediate and grateful. "Yes, sir. I haven't eaten since yesterday." That decided it. Whatever complicated feelings were stirring in Judson's chest, whatever warnings his protective instincts were whispering, a hungry child trumped everything else. "Come on up here, then. Let's see what we can find in the kitchen." Noah climbed the porch steps slowly, exhaustion evident in every movement. Up close, Judson could see that the boy was even thinner than he'd first appeared, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. There were blisters on his feet, visible through worn spots in his sneakers, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. Inside, Judson guided Noah to the kitchen table and set about preparing food. He heated up a can of soup and made sandwiches from leftover roast beef, working with an efficiency born of years of cooking for himself. But having someone else in the kitchen changed everything. The space felt smaller somehow, more intimate, charged with the presence of another human being. Noah ate with the careful restraint of a child who had learned not to take food for granted, but Judson could see the hunger beneath his good manners. When the boy finished his first serving, Judson wordlessly ladled more soup into his bowl and added another sandwich to his plate. "Thank you," Noah said quietly. "I didn't think anyone would help me." "Why not?" Noah shrugged, a gesture that seemed too old for his years. "Most people don't like kids who don't belong to anyone." The words hit Judson like a physical blow. He set down his coffee cup and studied the boy's face, seeing now what he'd missed before, the wariness in his eyes, the way he held himself ready to run or defend himself. This child had learned hard lessons about the world's indifference to vulnerable people. "How old are you, Noah?" 10. "I'll be 11 in December." The same age Tommy had been when he died. Judson pushed that thought away, but not before it sent a sharp pang through his chest. "Tell me about your father. What happened?" Noah's hands stilled on his spoon. For a moment, Judson thought the boy might not answer, but then the words came in a quiet rush. "He's been sad for a long time. Since my mama died 3 years ago, he tried to take care of me, but he started drinking and couldn't keep a job. Last week, he said we were going on a trip, but when we got to Denver, he bought me a bus ticket and told me to find somewhere better." The matter-of-fact way Noah recounted this abandonment was heartbreaking. There was no self-pity in his voice, no dramatic emotion, just the resigned acceptance of a child who had learned that adults could disappear from his life without warning. "He gave me this," Noah continued, touching the satchel beside his chair. "Said it had important papers and that I should keep it safe. He said maybe someday I'd understand why he had to leave me." Judson felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, not at the boy, but at the circumstances that had brought him here. What kind of man abandoned his child in a strange city with nothing but a bus ticket and a vague instruction to find pretty country? The more he learned about Noah's situation, the more his protective instincts awakened. Where were you living before Denver? Chicago mostly, sometimes other places when Dad found work. Noah's eyes grew distant. We moved around a lot after Mama died. Dad said staying in one place made him remember too much. Judson understood that impulse all too well. After Emma and Tommy died, he'd considered selling the ranch and starting over somewhere else. The difference was that he'd had the luxury of choice and the wisdom to recognize that running from grief rarely worked. This man had been selfish enough to make his son pay the price for his inability to cope. As Noah continued eating, Judson found himself studying the boy's features more carefully. There was intelligence in his face, a quick awareness that suggested he'd learned to read situations and adapt quickly. His speech was more articulate than many children his age, and despite his current circumstances, there were hints of good breeding in his manners and bearing. "Noah," Judson said carefully, "do you have any other family? Grandparents, aunts, or uncles?" The boy shook his head. "Mama was an only child, and her parents died before I was born. Dad said his family disowned him when he married Mama because she wasn't good enough for them." There was a flash of old hurt in Noah's eyes. "He said they were rich and mean, and we were better off without them." Rich. That was an interesting detail, especially combined with the quality of Noah's satchel and the educated way he spoke. Judson filed that information away for later consideration. After Noah finished eating, Judson showed him to the bathroom and found him clean clothes, an old shirt, and a pair of jeans that had belonged to Tommy, kept in a box in the hall closet. They were too big, but Noah rolled up the sleeves and cuffs without complaint. When the boy emerged from his shower, clean and dressed in the borrowed clothes, Judson felt his heart perform some complicated maneuver in his chest. Noah looked so young and vulnerable, and so much like what Tommy might have looked like at 10, that it was almost unbearable. "Sir," Noah said hesitantly, "I know I asked for just one night, but I don't have anywhere else to go. If you let me stay a little longer, I could work for my keep. I'm good at chores, and I learn fast." Judson looked into those hopeful eyes and felt the last of his resistance crumble. He'd spent 5 years building walls around his heart, carefully constructing a life that couldn't hurt him because it couldn't disappoint him. This boy threatened all of that with his presence, his need, his unconscious echoes of the son Judson had lost. But perhaps some walls were meant to be torn down. "You can stay as long as you need to, Noah," he heard himself say. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." The smile that lit up Noah's face was like sunrise after the longest night, and Judson realized that his carefully ordered, emotionally barricaded life had just been turned upside down by a 10-year-old boy with a worn leather satchel and no place else to go. Dawn came earlier than usual to Cedar Mesa, or perhaps it only seemed that way because Judson had spent most of the night lying awake, listening to the soft breathing from the guest room down the hall. He'd given Noah clean sheets and one of Emma's old quilts, and the boy had fallen asleep almost instantly, exhaustion finally claiming him. But sleep had eluded Judson. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy's face in Noah's features, heard Emma's voice asking him what he thought he was doing, taking in a strange child without knowing anything about his background or circumstances. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons this was a bad idea, the legal complications, the emotional risks, the way his carefully constructed solitude was already beginning to crack around the edges. Yet when he finally rose and padded to the kitchen to start coffee, he found himself moving more quietly than usual, mindful of the sleeping child under his roof. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the sun was painting the eastern windows gold. His hair was tousled from sleep, and Tommy's pajamas hung loose on his thin frame, but his eyes were bright and alert. "Good morning, sir," he said politely. "I hope I didn't oversleep." "It's Judson," he said, pouring a second cup of coffee and adding plenty of milk and sugar before handing it to the boy. "And you're up plenty early. Most kids your age would sleep until noon given the chance." Noah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his small hands around the warm mug. "Dad always said idle hands were the devil's playground. I'm used to getting up early." There was something touching about the way Noah quoted his absent father, still trying to follow rules set by a man who had abandoned him. Judson filed that observation away, alongside all the other small details he was collecting about this unexpected houseguest. "Well, there's plenty of work to be done around here, if you're serious about earning your keep," Judson said. "But first, let's get some breakfast in you." As they ate scrambled eggs and toast, Judson found himself studying Noah's mannerisms. The boy ate with good table manners, said please and thank you without prompting, and asked thoughtful questions about the ranch. There was a gravity to him that seemed unusual for his age, as if he'd been forced to grow up faster than childhood should allow. After breakfast, Judson led Noah outside to begin the morning chores. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the full scope of the ranch, the sprawling pastures, the sturdy barn, the cattle scattered across the grassland like brown and black dots. "It's beautiful," Noah said softly. "I've never seen so much space." "Gets lonely sometimes," Judson replied, then immediately regretted the admission. He wasn't used to sharing his thoughts, especially the melancholy ones. They started with the horses, 3/4 horses that Judson kept for ranch work. Noah was initially nervous around the large animals, but he listened carefully to Judson's instructions about moving slowly and speaking in calm tones. By the time they'd finished feeding and watering the horses, Noah was gently stroking the nose of Daisy, the oldest and gentlest of the three. "She likes you," Judson observed, watching the way the mare leaned into Noah's touch. "Animals are easier than people sometimes," Noah said, then seemed surprised by his own words. I know what you mean," Judson said quietly. Next came feeding the cattle, which required loading hay bales onto the bed of Judson's pickup truck and driving out to the various feeding stations scattered across the property. Noah rode in the passenger seat, asking questions about the different breeds of cattle and the challenges of raising livestock in the high desert climate. "Why did you choose this place?" Noah asked as they bumped along a dirt track toward the north pasture. Judson considered the question. He'd gotten variations of it before from visitors and neighbors, but something about Noah's earnest curiosity made him want to give a real answer. "I was in the army for 8 years, he said finally. "Spent most of that time in places where there were too many people and too much noise. When I got out, I wanted somewhere I could think, where the only sounds were natural ones. Found this place and knew it was home." "Were you lonely?" Before, Noah caught himself, clearly realizing that his question might venture into painful territory. "Before my wife and son died?" Judson finished gently. "No, I wasn't lonely then. Emma and Tommy made this place feel alive. After they were gone, I got used to the quiet." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Noah proving surprisingly helpful despite his small size. He was quick to anticipate what Judson needed, handing him tools before being asked and following instructions with the kind of focused attention that spoke of intelligence and eagerness to please. It was during their lunch break, sitting on the porch with sandwiches and cold water, that Noah brought up the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them all morning. "Mr. Judson," he said carefully, "I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of your kindness. If you need me to move on, I understand." Judson set down his sandwich and studied the boy's face. There was no manipulation in Noah's expression, no calculated attempt to pull at heartstrings. Just honest concern, and the kind of premature wisdom that came from learning too young that nothing in life was guaranteed. "What would moving on look like for you, Noah?" Judson asked. The boy shrugged. "There are shelters in bigger towns, foster homes maybe. I'm good at adapting." The casual way Noah discussed these options as if shuffling from institution to institution was a normal part of childhood sent a spike of anger through Judson's chest. Not anger at Noah, but at a world that could treat a 10-year-old boy as if he were a problem to be managed rather than a child to be cherished. "And is that what you want?" Noah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to stay here, With you, but I don't want to be a burden." The words hit Judson like a physical blow. He thought of all the ways this boy could never be a burdened life he brought to the empty house, the purpose he gave to morning routines, the simple human connection that Judson hadn't realized he'd been starving for. But instead of voicing those thoughts, he said simply, "You're not a burden, Noah. You're welcome to stay as long as you like." That afternoon, Judson found himself in his workshop, a converted corner of the barn, where he'd once built furniture and toys for his family. He hadn't touched his woodworking tools in years, but something about Noah's presence had awakened old instincts. He selected a piece of oak from his carefully preserved lumber pile and began to carve. His hands remembered the familiar motions, the careful cuts and patient shaping that transformed raw wood into something beautiful and functional. As he worked, he could hear Noah outside, talking to the horses in the soft, encouraging voice he'd been using with the animals all day. By evening, Judson had completed his projector small wooden horse, carved with the kind of attention to detail that had once made his handmade toys the envy of other parents in town. The horse was simple but elegant, with a flowing mane and alert ears, polished to a warm honey color. He found Noah in the kitchen, attempting to prepare dinner with the kind of determined concentration that suggested he'd had to cook for himself before. The boy looked up as Judson entered, and his face lit up with relief. "I thought maybe I could make dinner for us," Noah said, "but I'm not very good at cooking yet." "That's all right," Judson said, setting the wooden horse on the table between them. "Learning takes time." Noah's eyes widened as he saw the carving. He reached out tentatively, as if afraid the horse might disappear if he touched it. "You made this?" "I used to carve things for my son," Judson said quietly. "Thought you might like to have it." Noah picked up the horse with careful hands, turning it over to admire the craftsmanship. When he looked up at Judson, there were tears in his eyes. "No one's ever made anything just for me before," he said. Judson felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands he'd wrapped around his heart. This boy, this unexpected gift, was teaching him that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about having the courage to embrace the future. "Well," he said gruffly, "now someone has." 3 weeks had passed since Noah's arrival, and the ranch had begun to feel different in ways both subtle and profound. The silence that had once been Judson's closest companion was now punctuated by the sound of Noah's voice asking questions, humming tunelessly while he worked, or reading aloud from books they shared in the evenings. It was during one of these evening reading sessions that Judson made a decision that surprised even him. Noah had been struggling with a passage from one of the adult novels Judson typically read, his brow furrowed with concentration as he sounded out unfamiliar words. "Maybe we need something more your speed," Judson said, setting down his coffee cup. "I don't mind the hard words," Noah replied quickly. "I like learning new ones." But Judson was already moving, walking purposefully toward the hallway that led to the closed-off parts of the house. He paused outside Tommy's room, his hand on the doorknob, gathering the courage he'd been building for days. The door opened with a soft creak, releasing the musty smell of a space too long unopened. Afternoon sunlight slanted through dusty windows, illuminating the room exactly as he'd left it 5 years ago. The bed was still made with Tommy's favorite dinosaur sheets. His toys were arranged on shelves, just as Emma had organized them. And there, in the corner bookshelf, was the collection of children's books they'd read together every night. Judson's chest tightened as he approached the bookshelf, but the pain was different, now still sharp, but somehow bearable. He selected several volumes: Where the Red Fern Grows, The Secret Garden, Island of the Blue Dolphins, stories that had captivated Tommy's imagination and might do the same for Noah. When he returned to the living room, Noah was sitting exactly where he'd left him, the wooden horse Judson had carved for him never far from reach. The boy's eyes widened when he saw the books in Judson's arms. "These were my sons," Judson said, settling back into his chair. "I thought you might enjoy them." Noah accepted the books with the reverence he seemed to reserve for anything precious or fragile. He ran his fingers over the worn covers, opening one to reveal Tommy's name, carefully written in a child's handwriting on the inside cover. "Tommy," Noah read aloud, then looked up at Judson. "Was he my age?" "He was 10 when he died," Judson said, surprised by how easily the words came. He'd hardly spoken Tommy's name aloud in years, but somehow, with Noah, it felt natural. "What was he like?" Judson leaned back in his chair, letting memories surface that he'd kept buried for too long. "He was curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. He loved animals, especially the horses, and he was brave sometimes, too brave for his own good." Noah listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested he understood the gift he was being given, not just the books, but the memories that came with them. "Do I remind you of him?" Noah asked quietly. It was a perceptive question, one that cut to the heart of something Judson had been grappling with since the boy's arrival. "In some ways," he admitted. "But you're your own person, Noah. You don't have to be anyone but yourself here." That night, Judson listened to the sound of Noah reading aloud to himself in the guest room, his voice gradually growing sleepy as he worked through the first chapter of Where the Red Fern Grows. It was a sound the house had been missing, the gentle murmur of childhood settling into sleep. The next morning brought their first real challenge. Noah woke with a fever and a cough that spoke of too many nights sleeping rough before he'd found his way to the ranch. Judson, who hadn't tended a sick child in years, found himself digging through medicine cabinets and calling the doctor in Cedar Bluff for advice. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been the town's physician for more than a decade, and she'd treated Tommy's scraped knees and childhood illnesses before the fire. When she arrived at the ranch to check on Noah, her expression was carefully neutral, but Judson could see the questions in her eyes. "He'll be fine," she said after examining the boy. "Just a mild respiratory infection, probably brought on by stress and exposure. Rest and fluids should clear it up in a few days." As they stood on the porch after her examination, Dr. Martinez fixed Judson with a steady look. "I have to ask Judson, what's the boy's situation? Does he have family looking for him?" "His father abandoned him," Judson said simply. "As far as I know, there's no one else." "And you're planning to?" "Take care of him," Judson finished. "For now, at least." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. She'd known Judson long enough to understand the significance of this decision. "There will be legal considerations eventually, but for now, the boy needs stability and care. You're providing both." Over the next few days, as Noah recovered from his illness, Judson found himself falling into patterns he hadn't experienced since Tommy was alive. He checked on the boy throughout the night, feeling his forehead for fever and adjusting blankets. He prepared soft foods and encouraged him to drink plenty of water. He read aloud when Noah was too tired to read to himself. It was during one of these bedside vigils that Noah asked the question Judson had been dreading. "What happened to your family?" Judson was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much truth a 10-year-old could handle. Finally, he said, "There was a fire. They were caught in the house when I was out working. I couldn't save them." Noah's fever-bright eyes were full of sympathy beyond his years. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "That must hurt worse than anything." "It did," Judson admitted. "It still does sometimes, but having you hear it helps. Because I remind you of Tommy." "No," Judson said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Because you remind me that caring about someone is worth the risk of losing them." As Noah drifted back to sleep, Judson remained in the bedside chair, watching the boy's peaceful face in the lamplight. Somewhere in the past few weeks, without his conscious permission, this child had become important to him. Not as a replacement for Tommy, but as himself, Noah Mitchell, brave and resilient and deserving of all the love Judson had thought he'd buried with his family. When Noah was fully recovered, they fell back into their routine of shared chores and quiet companionship. But something had shifted during his illness, a deepening of trust and affection that made their bond feel more solid, more permanent. It was Noah who brought up the subject of his education, mentioning casually that he'd been enrolled in school in Chicago before his father's drinking cost them their housing. "I'm supposed to be in 5th grade," he said as they mended fence wire on a crisp October morning. "I don't want to fall behind." Judson had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would require contact with the outside world and potentially unwelcome questions about Noah's status. But the boy's education was important, and Judson wouldn't let his own discomfort interfere with Noah's future. "We'll figure something out," he promised. "Maybe I can drive you into town for school." Noah was quiet for a moment, then said, "What if they ask questions about where I came from or who my guardian is?" It was a valid concern, one that highlighted the precarious nature of their situation. Legally, Judson had no claim to Noah, no official standing that would allow him to make decisions about the boy's education or medical care. They were living in a gray area that couldn't last indefinitely. "We'll deal with whatever comes," Judson said finally. "The important thing is making sure you get the schooling you need." That evening, Judson made calls to the school district and discovered that enrolling Noah would require documentation. He didn't have birth certificates, previous school records, proof of guardianship. Each conversation made it clearer that their informal arrangement would soon need to become something more official. But for now, in the golden light of autumn on Cedar Mesa, with Noah's laughter echoing across the pastures and the scent of wood smoke from their evening fires filling the air, Judson was content to postpone those complications. He was learning that some things were worth fighting for, worth the risk and uncertainty they brought. As October deepened into November, Noah's presence had transformed not just the house, but Judson himself. The man who had spoken to no one for weeks at a time now found himself looking forward to their dinner conversations. The hands that had forgotten how to create beauty were once again carving toys and fixing broken things. The heart that had been carefully frozen was slowly, cautiously learning to hope again. On the evening that marked exactly 1 month since Noah's arrival, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mesa in shades of orange and purple. Noah had the wooden horse in his hands, as he often did, turning it over and running his fingers along its carved lines. "Judson," he said quietly. "Yes? When my dad left me, I thought no one would ever want me, but you did. Why?" Judson considered the question, searching for words that could encompass the complicated truth. "Sometimes," he said finally, "two broken people can help fix each other." Noah looked up at him with those wise, too-old eyes. "Are we fixing each other?" "I think we might be," Judson replied, and for the first time in years, he meant it. Winter arrived early on Cedar Mesa that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught even Judson off guard. By late November, snow lay thick across the pastures, and the morning temperature readings made him grateful for the shelter of the barn and the warmth of the house, where Noah waited with hot coffee and questions about the day's work. The boy had grown in the 2 months since his arrival, not just in height, though Judson had already had to buy him new clothes in town, but in confidence and security. The haunted wariness that had marked his early days at the ranch had gradually been replaced by the natural curiosity and energy of childhood. Noah laughed more easily now, asked questions without fear of being told he was bothersome, and had developed the kind of easy familiarity with the animals that spoke of genuine affection. But it was during one of their trips to Cedar Bluff for supplies that Judson was reminded of how fragile their situation really was. They'd stopped at Miller's Feed and Hardware, as they did every few weeks, to pick up grain for the horses and miscellaneous supplies for the ranch. Noah had wandered off to look at the display of saddles and bridles, while Judson conducted business with Bob Miller, the store's owner. "That your boy?" Bob asked with studied casualness as he rang up Judson's purchases. "He's staying with me," Judson replied carefully. "Heard talk that you'd taken in a stray," Bob continued, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Folks are wondering about his people, where he came from." Judson felt his jaw tighten. He'd known this conversation was inevitable in a small town like Cedar Bluff. The sudden appearance of a child living with the area's most notorious hermit was bound to generate interest and speculation. "Noah's family situation is complicated," he said evenly. "He needed a place to stay, and I had room." Bob nodded slowly, but Judson could see that the man's curiosity wasn't satisfied. Course, with winter coming on, you'll probably want to get him enrolled in school. Margaret Hastings down at the elementary is real good, with kids who've had it rough. We're working on that, Judson said, though they both knew he was stalling. The conversation stayed with him during the drive home, Noah chattering beside him about the horses he'd seen and asking technical questions about the care and feeding of livestock. The boys' easy contentment was a sharp contrast to Judson's growing anxiety about their legal situation. That evening, after Noah had gone to bed with one of Tommy's books, Judson found himself in his bedroom, standing before the dresser where he kept Emma's jewelry box and the few mementos he'd salvaged from the fire. His hands shook slightly as he opened the small wooden box and withdrew the item he'd been avoiding for weeks. His wedding ring. He'd stopped wearing it 6 months after the funeral, finding that the weight of it on his finger was a constant reminder of everything he'd lost. But now, as he held it up to the lamplight, he found himself thinking not about the past, but about the future. About the possibility of a different kind of family, one not built on blood or law, but on choice and commitment. He slipped the ring onto his finger, testing how it felt after so long an absence. The gold was warm against his skin, familiar despite the years of separation. In the mirror, he could see that he looked different than he had 2 months ago, less hollow, more present. Noah's influence, he realized, had been working changes in him that went deeper than he'd understood. The next morning brought their first real test. Noah woke with nightmares, crying out in his sleep for his father, begging the man not to leave him. Judson rushed to the boy's room to find him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face, clutching the wooden horse like a talisman. "He was here," Noah gasped between sobs. "In my dream he came back, but then he left again. He said I wasn't worth keeping." Judson sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the boy into his arms, feeling the fragile weight of him, the rapid beating of his heart against his chest. "It was just a dream, Noah, just a dream." "But what if it's true?" Noah whispered. "What if I'm not worth keeping? What if you change your mind too?" The question hit Judson like a physical blow. He realized that beneath Noah's growing confidence and happiness, the fundamental fear remained the terror of abandonment that his father's betrayal had carved into his young heart. "Listen to me," Judson said, lifting Noah's chin so their eyes met. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. But what if someone comes to take me away? What if the law says I have to go?" It was the question Judson had been dreading, the one that highlighted every uncertainty about their situation. He thought about the legal research he'd been doing in secret, the calls to lawyers in Salt Lake City who'd explained the complexities of guardianship and adoption. The process was daunting, expensive, and far from guaranteed, especially for a single man with no official relationship to the child. "Then we'll fight," he said simply. "We'll fight for each other." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following weeks, they began to speak more openly about their hopes and fears, about the future they were tentatively building together. Noah talked about his memories of his mother, sharing stories that revealed a woman who had loved him deeply, despite their difficult circumstances. Judson found himself sharing memories of Emma and Tommy, not as ghosts that haunted him, but as beloved family members whose memory could coexist with new love. It was during one of these conversations that Noah made a revelation that changed everything. They were working in the barn, repairing tack by lamplight, while the wind howled outside, when Noah suddenly set down the leather he'd been oiling and looked at Judson with an expression of unusual seriousness. "There's something I haven't told you," he said quietly, "about my family, about why Dad might have left me." Judson set down his tools and gave Noah his full attention. "What is it?" "My mom came from money," Noah said. "A lot of money. Her family didn't approve of Dad because he was poor, but she married him anyway. When she died, there was supposed to be an inheritance for me when I turned 18. The pieces began to fall into place, Noah's refined mannerisms, his educated speech, the quality of his possessions, despite their current worn condition. "Dad was supposed to be the trustee," Noah continued. "But he said the lawyers and my mom's family were trying to take it away from us. That's why we kept moving, why he drank so much. He said they were always watching, always trying to prove he wasn't fit to take care of me. Do you know how much money we're talking about? Judson asked gently. Noah shrugged. Dad never said exactly, but I heard him on the phone once talking about millions. Millions of dollars, Judson. Can you imagine? Judson could imagine, and what he imagined made his blood run cold. If Noah was truly heir to that kind of wealth, then his father's abandonment might not have been simple neglect or inability to cope. It might have been something far more calculated, a way to remove himself from the legal complications while ensuring that Noah disappeared from the sight of people who might have legitimate claims on his guardianship. Noah, he said carefully, this inheritance, you have any papers about it? Anything that might prove your identity or your claim to the money? The boy nodded toward his leather satchel, which sat on a nearby hay bale. Dad gave me some papers, said they were important, that I should keep them safe, but I've been afraid to look at them. As Noah retrieved the satchel and began to unpack its contents, Judson felt a growing certainty that their quiet life on Cedar Mesa was about to become much more complicated. But looking at the boy's trusting face, seeing the love and hope that had grown between them over the past 2 months, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The family they had chosen was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The papers that Noah spread across the workbench told a story that was both more complex and more troubling than either of them had anticipated. Even in the lamplight of the barn, with some documents partially damaged by water and time, the legal language was clear enough to paint a picture of substantial wealth and bitter family conflict. There were fragments of trust documents bearing the letterhead of prestigious Chicago law firms, bank statements showing accounts with 7-figure balances, and most significantly, a partially burned copy of a will that named Noah as the primary beneficiary of the estate of Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore, Mitchell, his mother. Whitmore, Judson read aloud, studying the elegant script on the legal documents. That was your mother's family name? Noah nodded. She used to tell me stories about growing up in a big house with gardens and horses, but she said her parents were cold people who cared more about money than love. Judson continued reading, piecing together the story from the legal fragments. Catherine Whitmore had been the only child of a wealthy Chicago family with interests in real estate and manufacturing. When she married Noah's father, a working-class man named David Mitchell, her parents had threatened to disinherit her. She'd called their bluff, and they'd followed through on the threat, cutting her off completely. But when Catherine died 3 years ago, the family money had nowhere else to go. Her parents were dead, she had no siblings, and under the terms of various trusts and wills, the bulk of the Whitmore fortune was destined for Noah, the grandson the family had never acknowledged. Look at this, Judson said, pointing to a document that appeared to be correspondence from a law firm. Even damaged, the letterhead was impressive. Hartwell, Stevens, Associates, with an address on North Michigan Avenue. It says here that your father was appointed as trustee of your inheritance until you reach majority age. But he left me, Noah said quietly. What happens to the money now? It was a good question, and one that made Judson increasingly uneasy. In his experience, that kind of wealth didn't just sit unclaimed. Somewhere, lawyers and distant relatives and opportunistic strangers were probably already maneuvering to position themselves as Noah's guardian, each with their own agenda for the boy's fortune. Noah, he said carefully, have you ever met any of your mother's family? Aunts, uncles, cousins? The boy shook his head. Mom said they didn't want anything to do with us. She said they were the kind of people who measured everything in dollars and couldn't understand why she'd choose love over money. But people's attitudes toward family could change dramatically when millions of dollars were involved, Judson reflected grimly. The very relatives who had shunned Noah and his parents might now see the boy as their ticket to accessing the Whitmore fortune. Over the next several days, Judson found himself consumed with research and worry. He made discreet calls to lawyers in Salt Lake City and Denver, trying to understand the legal implications of their situation without revealing too many details. What he learned wasn't encouraging. As things stood, Noah was essentially a missing person. His father had abandoned him without making any legal arrangements for his care. If the boy's identity and whereabouts became known to the wrong people, Judson would have no legal standing to protect him. Any blood relative, no matter how distant, would have a stronger claim to guardianship than a stranger with no legal relationship to the child. Meanwhile, Noah seemed blissfully unaware of the storm clouds gathering on their horizon. He threw himself into ranch life with the enthusiasm of a boy who had finally found security and belonging. He'd grown remarkably over the past 3 months, filling out under the influence of regular meals and physical work. His face had lost the hollow, wary look of a child who'd learned not to trust in permanence. But Judson could see the intelligence in Noah's eyes, the way he sometimes caught adults in unguarded moments and seemed to understand more than he let on. The boy knew their situation was precarious, even if he didn't fully grasp the legal complexities involved. It was during a trip to town in early December that their fragile peace was first threatened. Judson had taken Noah to see Dr. Martinez for a routine checkup, something that had required careful navigation of questions about guardianship and medical authority. The doctor had been discreet and understanding, but Judson could see the concern in her eyes. They were leaving the medical clinic when a stranger approached them in the parking lot. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of money and professional success. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Excuse me," the man said, directing his attention to Noah with an intensity that immediately put Judson on guard. "Are you Noah Mitchell?" Noah stepped closer to Judson, instinctively seeking protection. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but there was something calculated in the expression. "My name is Marcus Whitmore. I believe I'm your cousin, your mother's cousin. I've been looking for you for quite some time." Judson felt ice form in his stomach. This was exactly what he'd been dreading, the moment when Noah's past would catch up with their carefully constructed present. "I think there's been some mistake," Judson said evenly. "Noah is Noah Mitchell, son of Catherine Whitmore Mitchell and David Mitchell," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "Born December 15th in Chicago. Missing from his legal guardian's care since early September." His smile sharpened. "There's no mistake, Mr. Tate. I've done my research." Noah's hand found Judson's, gripping it tightly. The boy's face had gone pale, and Judson could feel him trembling. "What do you want?" Judson asked. "I want to take my young cousin home where he belongs," Marcus replied. "The Whitmore family has been very worried about Noah since his father abandoned him. We've been working with private investigators to locate him." "And now that you have—" Marcus reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded document. "I have a court order granting me temporary guardianship, pending a formal custody hearing. Noah needs to come with me today." The world seemed to tilt around Judson's feet. In the space of a few minutes, their life together, the family they'd been building, the security Noah had finally found, was being torn apart by a stranger with legal papers and ulterior motives. "No," Noah said suddenly, his voice small but determined. "I don't want to go with you. I want to stay with Judson." Marcus's expression softened in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand this is frightening, Noah. You've been through a lot, but family takes care of family. You'll be much better off with people who can provide for you properly." "Judson provides for me just fine," Noah replied, and Judson felt a surge of pride at the boy's courage. "Mr. Whitmore," Judson said carefully, "I'd like to see that court order, and I'd like to call my lawyer before Noah goes anywhere." "Of course," Marcus replied smoothly, "though I should mention that interfering with a legal guardian's custody could be considered kidnapping. I'm sure you wouldn't want any unpleasant legal complications." The threat was delivered with a smile, but it was a threat nonetheless. Judson found himself in an impossible position, legally powerless, to protect the boy he'd come to love as a son, facing a man who clearly had resources and connections that Judson couldn't match. But as he looked down at Noah's frightened face, saw the trust and desperation in those familiar brown eyes, Judson knew that legal niceties were secondary to the fundamental obligation to protect a child who had already been abandoned once. "We'll fight this," he said quietly, his words directed more to Noah than to Marcus. "Whatever it takes, we'll fight this." Marcus Whitmore's smile never wavered, but something cold and calculating flickered in his eyes. "I certainly hope you'll be reasonable, Mr. Tate. For Noah's sake, of course. Court battles can be so traumatic for children." As they drove back to the ranch in tense silence, Noah clutching the wooden horse like a lifeline, Judson's mind raced through options and possibilities. None of them looked good. But he'd made a promise to this boy, and he intended to keep it, regardless of the cost. The battle for Noah's future was about to begin, and Judson knew it would be the fight of his life. The legal papers that Marcus Whitmore presented were as legitimate as they were devastating. Judson spent the better part of that evening on the phone with lawyers, each conversation confirming what he'd already suspected: his position was legally untenable. Marcus had filed for emergency guardianship in Cook County, Illinois, citing Noah's abandonment and the need for immediate family intervention. The boy's disappearance from Chicago and subsequent appearance in Utah had been characterized as potential kidnapping, with Judson portrayed as either a willing participant or an unwitting accomplice. "The problem," explained Rebecca Torres, the family law attorney Judson had finally convinced to take his call, "is that you have no legal relationship to the child. Even if your intentions are pure, the court's primary concern will be returning Noah to his legal family." "But what if his legal family doesn't have his best interests at heart?" Judson asked, pacing his kitchen while Noah sat at the table, ostensibly doing homework but clearly listening to every word. "That's something you'd have to prove," Torres replied, "and proving unfitness against a family member with substantial resources and no criminal history is extremely difficult." After he hung up, Judson sat across from Noah at the kitchen table, trying to find words that could provide comfort in an impossible situation. "What's going to happen to me?" Noah asked quietly. "I don't know," Judson admitted, "but I promise you this: I'm not giving up. Whatever it takes, I'm going to fight for you." Noah nodded, but Judson could see the fear in his eyes, the terrible familiarity of abandonment settling over him like a shroud. The next morning brought Marcus Whitmore to their door, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy and armed with the full weight of legal authority. He looked perfectly reasonable in his expensive coat and practiced smile, the picture of a concerned family member doing his civic duty. "I hope you've had time to consider your position, Mr. Tate," Marcus said as Judson reluctantly invited them inside. "I'd hate for this to become more complicated than necessary." Noah appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, his face pale but determined. He dressed in his best clothesa shirt and slacks that Judson had bought him for their trips to Townend. He carried himself with a dignity that made Judson's heart ache with pride. "Hello, Noah," Marcus said, his voice carefully modulated to project warmth and family concern. "I'm Marcus Whitmore, your mother's cousin. I've come to take you home." "This is my home," Noah replied quietly. Marcus's smile flickered slightly. "I understand you've grown attached to Mr. Tate, but family is family, Noah. The Whitmore family has resources and connections that can provide you with opportunities Mr. Tate simply can't match. Private schools, the best colleges, a trust fund that will ensure your security for life." "I don't care about money," Noah said. "You say that now, but you're young. You don't understand what these things mean for your future." Marcus's tone remained patient, but Judson could hear the steel underneath. "Besides, there are legal obligations involved. The estate your mother left you requires proper management." That was when the pieces clicked into place for Judson. This wasn't about family concern or Noah's welfare. This was about money, millions of dollars in trust funds and inheritance that Marcus Whitmore wanted to control. "How exactly are you related to Noah's mother?" Judson asked. Marcus turned his attention to Judson with obvious reluctance. "Catherine and I were second cousins. Our grandfathers were brothers." "That's a pretty distant relationship to justify emergency guardianship," Judson observed. "I'm the closest living relative," Marcus replied smoothly. And unlike certain people, I have the legal standing and financial resources to provide proper care for Noah." The sheriff's deputy, who had been standing silently near the door, finally spoke up. "Mr. Tate, I'm sorry, but I have to enforce this custody order. The boy needs to come with Mr. Whitmore." Judson felt everything slipping away, the future he'd begun to envision, the family he'd learned to love, the sense of purpose that Noah had restored to his life. But as he looked at the boy's frightened face, he knew he couldn't simply surrender without understanding what they were really dealing with. "Noah," he said quietly, "go pack your things. Take whatever you want to take with you." As Noah disappeared down the hallway toward his room, Judson turned his attention back to Marcus. "I'd like to know more about this estate you're so concerned about managing. As Noah's temporary guardian, you'll have significant control over his financial affairs, won't you?" Marcus's smile became more genuine, though no warmer. "The Whitmore family has been managing substantial assets for generations, Mr. Tate. Noah will be in excellent hands. And you'll benefit from managing those assets, I assume. Trustee fees, investment commissions, that sort of thing." "The family's financial arrangements are hardly your concern," Marcus replied, but Judson could see he'd hit a nerve. It was then that Noah reappeared, carrying his worn leather satchel and the wooden horse Judson had carved for him. But instead of the defeated resignation Judson had expected, there was something almost triumphant in the boy's expression. "I'm ready," Noah announced. But he walked directly to Judson and held out a folded piece of paper. "But first, I want Mr. Tate to have this. It's important." Judson unfolded the paper and felt his breath catch. It was a letter, written in an adult's careful handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before Noah's father had abandoned him. "My dearest Noah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have failed you in the worst possible way, and I pray that you will someday forgive me. I am not strong enough to protect you from the people who want to use you for your mother's money, but perhaps someone else will be. Your mother always believed that family was not about blood, but about love. She believed that the people who truly care for you will prove themselves through their actions, not their claims. I have enclosed documents that will help anyone who loves you to fight for you. Trust your heart, son. Trust the people who see you for who you are, not what you're worth. All my love, Dad." Attached to the letter were additional documents that Noah had been hiding in his satchel legal papers that painted a very different picture of Marcus Whitmore's motives and character. There were court filings from Chicago showing that Marcus had been challenging the validity of Catherine's will for the past 3 years, claiming that she had been mentally incompetent when she'd excluded the Whitmore family from her inheritance. There were private investigator reports documenting David Mitchell's struggles with alcoholism and depression, clearly intended to support a case for removing Noah from his father's care. And most damning of all, there were financial records showing that Marcus had been borrowing heavily against his own assets, apparently in anticipation of gaining control over Noah's trust fund. "This is very interesting reading," Judson said quietly, holding up the documents so Marcus could see them. "It appears you've been planning to gain control of Noah's inheritance for some time." Marcus's confident demeanor cracked slightly. "Those documents are private property. They were stolen." "They were given to me by Noah's father," Judson replied, "a man who was apparently more aware of your intentions than you realized." The sheriff's deputy stepped forward, his own expression now troubled. "Mr. Whitmore, is there something I should know about this situation?" "This is a private family matter," Marcus said quickly. "These documents are taken out of context." But Noah had moved to stand beside Judson, his young voice clear and determined. "Officer, I don't want to go with this man. My father warned me about people who would try to use me for money. I want to stay with Mr. Tate." The deputy looked between the adults, clearly out of his depth in what had suddenly become a much more complicated situation. "I think maybe we need to sort this out with a judge," he said finally. Marcus Whitmore's mask of family concern had slipped entirely, revealing the calculating opportunist underneath. "You can't fight this, Tate. I have resources you can't imagine. I'll bury you in legal fees and court proceedings." "Maybe," Judson replied evenly. "But now I know what we're really fighting, and so does Noah." As Marcus stormed out, promising legal action and making threats, Judson knelt down to Noah's level and looked into those brave, trusting eyes. "That was very smart, keeping those papers hidden," he said. "Dad told me to only show them to someone who really cared about me," Noah replied. "Someone who would fight for me, even when it was hard." Judson pulled the boy into a fierce hug, feeling the solid weight of him, the trust he represented, the future they were both willing to fight for. "Then let's get ready for the fight of our lives," he said. The custody hearing was scheduled for December 20th in the district court in Cedar Bluff, a compromise location that neither side had wanted, but both had agreed to accept. For Judson, it meant facing the battle on familiar ground, with the support of his community. For Marcus Whitmore, it meant dealing with a small-town judge who might be less impressed by Chicago lawyers and family pedigree than a big city court would be. In the 3 weeks leading up to the hearing, Judson threw himself into preparation with the same intensity he'd once brought to Army missions. Rebecca Torres, the family law attorney he'd hired, was cautiously optimistic about their chances, especially given the documents Noah's father had provided. But she was also realistic about the challenges they faced. "The good news is that these papers establish a clear pattern of Marcus Whitmore's financial motivations," she explained during one of their strategy sessions. "The bad news is that he's still Noah's closest blood relative, and family courts are reluctant to place children with non-relatives unless there's clear evidence of unfitness." "What constitutes clear evidence?" Judson asked. "Criminal behavior, substance abuse, documented neglect or abuse. Financial opportunism is concerning, but it's not automatically disqualifying. They would need more than Marcus's dubious motives to win custody. They would need to prove that Noah's best interests lay with Judson, despite the lack of any blood relationship between them. That meant building a case that went beyond legal technicalities to the heart of what family really meant. Torres had filed a motion for Judson to be appointed as Noah's guardian ad litem, arguing that the boy's own wishes should be given significant weight in the custody determination. They'd also requested a home study that would allow the court to evaluate both living situations. Meanwhile, the community of Cedar Bluff was rallying around Judson and Noah in ways that surprised them both. Word had spread about their situation, and the response had been overwhelming. Pete Hannigan, Judson's neighbor, had taken it upon himself to organize character witnesses and support for the custody hearing. "That boy belongs with you," Pete declared during one of his visits to the ranch. "Anyone with eyes can see that. He's thriving here, and you've come back to life since he arrived. That's got to count for something." Dr. Sarah Martinez had agreed to testify about Noah's physical and emotional health, documenting the remarkable improvement in his condition since arriving at the ranch. Margaret Hastings, the elementary school principal, had interviewed Noah as part of an educational assessment and would testify about his intelligence, stability, and clear preference for remaining with Judson. Even Bob Miller from the feed store had volunteered to speak on Judson's behalf, despite their limited relationship. "Maybe I didn't know you well before," he told Judson, "but I can see what kind of man you are by how you've cared for that boy." The most powerful evidence in their favor came from Noah himself. At Torres's suggestion, they'd arranged for the boy to be interviewed by a court-appointed child psychologist, Dr. Ellen Reeves, who would assess his emotional state and preferences regarding custody. Dr. Reeves spent 2 hours with Noah, and her report was unequivocal in its conclusions. The boy showed no signs of trauma or coercion regarding his relationship with Judson. Instead, he demonstrated a strong, healthy attachment and clearly articulated preference for remaining in Judson's care. Most importantly, when asked about his feelings regarding Marcus Whitmore, Noah expressed fear and distrust that seemed to stem from genuine concern rather than manipulation. The child's responses are consistent with someone who has found stability and security after a period of significant upheaval, Dr. Reeves wrote in her report. His emotional attachment to Mr. Tate appears genuine and beneficial to his psychological development. But Marcus Whitmore wasn't sitting idle during this period. He'd hired a team of lawyers from Chicago and was building his own case with the resources that substantial wealth could provide. Private investigators had been digging into Judson's background, looking for anything that could be used to question his fitness as a guardian. They'd found little Judson's military record was exemplary, his finances were stable if modest, and his reputation in the community was solid. Unable to attack Judson directly, Marcus's legal team focused instead on the irregularities of Noah's placement and the potential dangers of allowing a child to remain with a stranger who had no legal authority to make decisions about his welfare. What happens if the boy becomes seriously ill? Marcus's lead attorney would undoubtedly argue. What about educational decisions, medical emergencies, parental consent for activities? Mr. Tate has been playing house with someone else's child, but he has no legal right to make the decisions that real guardians must make. It was a compelling argument, and one that kept Judson awake at night. He'd been making decisions about Noah's welfare for months' medical care, education, daily activities, without any legal authority to do so. In many ways, Marcus was right. Judson had been acting as a parent, without any of the legal protections or responsibilities that parenthood entailed. 3 days before the hearing, Marcus made one final attempt to avoid a court battle. He appeared at the ranch alone this time, without lawyers or sheriff's deputies, projecting an image of reasonable family concern. "Mr. Tate," he said as Judson reluctantly invited him inside, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to propose a compromise." Noah was at school. Judson had finally managed to enroll him in Cedar Bluff Elementary through a combination of Dr. Martinez's advocacy and the school district's flexibility regarding unusual circumstances. The boy's absence meant they could speak freely, but it also meant Judson was operating without his strongest advocate. "What kind of compromise?" Judson asked warily. Marcus settled into the kitchen chair with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to negotiating. "I understand you've grown attached to Noah, and he to you. That's admirable, really. But the reality is that I'm going to win this custody case. I have better lawyers, more resources, and a legitimate blood relationship to the boy. If you're so confident, why are you here?" "Because I'm not unreasonable," Marcus replied smoothly. "Noah seems happy here, and I can see that you care about him. What if we could arrange something that works for everyone?" Judson said nothing, waiting for the offer he knew was coming. "I'm prepared to allow Noah to continue living with you," Marcus continued, "as his legal guardian, with full authority to make decisions about his welfare. You'd receive a generous monthly stipend to cover his expenses, plus additional funds for education, healthcare, whatever he needs. In exchange for, I would retain control of his financial inheritance as trustee. The boy would have access to the funds when he reaches majority, of course, but until then, the management of his assets would remain with family." It was a clever offer, one that addressed many of Judson's concerns while protecting Marcus's access to the very resources he was seeking to control. Noah would remain safe and cared for, while Marcus would have 8 years to benefit from managing millions of dollars in trust funds. "And if I refuse?" Marcus's mask of reasonableness slipped slightly. "Then I'll pursue full custody and make sure you never see Noah again. I'll also make sure that anyone who aided and abetted what amounts to kidnapping faces appropriate legal consequences." The threat was clear, and Judson could see that Marcus had done his homework about the potential legal vulnerabilities of everyone who had helped Noah stay in Utah. "I need time to think about it," Judson said finally. "Of course, but don't take too long. My offer expires when we walk into that courtroom." After Marcus left, Judson found himself pacing the ranch like a caged animal, weighing impossible choices. The pragmatic part of his mind recognized that Marcus's offer might be the best outcome they could hope for. Noah would remain safe and loved, while Judson would have legal authority to protect him from future challenges. But the deeper part of his heart recoiled at the idea of making any deal with a man whose motivations were so transparently selfish. How could he teach Noah about integrity and standing up for what's right if he compromised with someone who saw the boy as nothing more than a path to wealth. When Noah returned from school that afternoon, chattering about a science project and a new friend he'd made, Judson felt his resolve crystallize. This child, brilliant, resilient, full of potential, deserved better than being treated as a bargaining chip in Marcus Whitmore's financial schemes. "Noah," he said as they sat down to dinner, "we need to talk about the hearing." The boy's face grew serious, but he nodded. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Judson admitted, "but not of losing the case. I'm scared of not fighting hard enough for you." "What do you mean?" Judson took a deep breath and told Noah about Marcus's offer, explaining the terms and the implications. The boy listened with the kind of focused attention that reminded Judson how intelligent and perceptive he was. "So I could stay here, but he would control my mother's money?" Noah asked when Judson finished. "That's right." Noah was quiet for a long moment, turning his wooden horse over in his hands, as he often did when thinking deeply about something. "My mother always said that money couldn't buy the things that really mattered," he said finally. "She said it could buy comfort and security, but not love or happiness or family. What do you think we should do?" "I think we should fight," Noah said simply. "Not for the money, but for the principle. If we let him win because he's rich and powerful, what does that teach me about standing up for what's right?" Judson felt a surge of pride that nearly overwhelmed him. This 10-year-old boy had more moral courage than many adults he'd known. "It might mean we lose everything," he warned. "If the court rules against us, Marcus won't make that offer again." "Then we'll lose everything together," Noah replied. "But at least we'll lose it, fighting for what we believe in." The next morning, Judson called Rebecca Torres and told her to reject Marcus's offer. There would be no compromise, no negotiated settlement that traded Noah's autonomy for Judson's legal convenience. The final 2 days before the hearing passed, in a blur of preparation and nervous energy, community members stopped by the ranch to offer support and encouragement. A local newspaper reporter interviewed Judson and Noah about their story, resulting in an article that portrayed their fight in sympathetic terms. Most importantly, a petition signed by nearly 200 residents of Cedar Bluff was delivered to the courthouse, requesting that the judge consider the community's support for Noah's placement with Judson. The petition included testimonials from teachers, shopkeepers, neighbors, and fellow church members, all attesting to the positive changes they'd observed in both Noah and Judson since they'd become a family. On the evening before the hearing, as they sat by the fireplace with one of Tommy's old books open between them, Noah looked up at Judson with those wise, trusting eyes. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life." Judson felt tears sting his eyes as he pulled the boy close. "Mine too, son. Mine too." The battle for their family was about to begin, and regardless of the outcome, they would face it together with courage, integrity, and the unshakable bond of love that had grown between them in the shadow of Cedar Mesa. The courtroom in Cedar Bluff had never seen anything quite like the custody hearing of Noah Mitchell. By 8 in the morning, an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin, the small gallery was packed with community members who had come to show their support for Judson and Noah. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 60s who had presided over family court in this district for more than 2 decades, surveyed the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Judson sat at the plaintiff's table with Rebecca Torres, his hands folded carefully in his lap to prevent their trembling from showing. Beside him, Noah was dressed in his best clothes, clutching the wooden horse that had become his constant companion. The boy's face was pale but determined, and he sat with the kind of dignified composure that made Judson's heart ache with pride. Across the aisle, Marcus Whitmore commanded attention with his team of 3 Chicago attorneys, their expensive suits and polished confidence, a stark contrast to Torres's more modest presentation. Marcus himself looked every inch the successful businessman, projecting an image of stability and resources that Judson knew would be compelling to any judge concerned about a child's material welfare. Judge Morrison called the court to order and began with a brief explanation of the proceedings. This is a custody hearing to determine the best placement for Noah Mitchell, a minor child whose father abandoned him approximately 4 months ago. The petitioner, Marcus Whitmore, claims guardianship rights as the child's closest blood relative. The respondent, Judson Tate, seeks to retain custody as the child's de facto guardian and has filed for formal adoption. She turned her attention to Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Catherine Hartwell, who commanded the courtroom with practiced authority. "Your Honor," Hartwell began, "this case is fundamentally about returning a lost child to his rightful family. Noah Mitchell is the heir to a substantial estate left by his mother, Catherine Whitmore Mitchell. When his father abandoned him, the responsibility for his care naturally falls to his blood, relative specifically, my client, Marcus Whitmore, who is Noah's second cousin and closest living family member." Hartwell painted a picture of Marcus as a concerned relative who had spent considerable resources searching for Noah after his disappearance. She emphasized the Whitmore family's financial stability, their ability to provide educational opportunities that Judson couldn't match, and their legitimate concern about Noah's inheritance being properly managed. "While we don't question Mr. Tate's good intentions," Hartwell continued, "the fact remains that he has no legal relationship to this child. He is, in the eyes of the law, a stranger who has been making decisions about Noah's welfare without any authority to do so. Blood family connections exist for good reasons, Your Honor. They provide legal clarity, financial security, and the kind of generational stability that no informal arrangement can match." When Torres rose for her opening statement, the contrast in presentation was immediately apparent. Where Hartwell had been polished and commanding, Torres was warm and conversational, speaking directly to Judge Morrison, as if they were having a discussion rather than conducting a formal proceeding. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about family, but not the kind that appears on genealogy charts. It's about the family that Noah Mitchell chose when he knocked on Judson Tate's door and asked for shelter. It's about the man who opened that door and said, 'You can stay forever.'" Torres gestured toward the crowded gallery. "The people in this courtroom today represent Noah's real family, the community that has embraced him, the neighbors who have watched him thrive, the teachers who have seen him blossom under Mr. Tate's care. Blood relationships are important, Your Honor, but they don't automatically create the love, stability, and commitment that this child needs." She outlined the evidence they would present. Noah's dramatic improvement in health and emotional stability since living with Judson, the community support for their placement, and most importantly, the boy's own clearly expressed wishes about his future. We will show that Marcus Whitmore's interest in Noah stems not from family affection, but from financial opportunity. We will demonstrate that Noah's best interest is emotional, educational, and physical welfare are best served by remaining with the man who has already proven his commitment through months of loving care. The first witness called was Dr. Sarah Martinez, who testified about Noah's condition when he first arrived at the ranch and his remarkable improvement over the subsequent months. "The child I examined in September was undernourished, dehydrated, and showing clear signs of emotional trauma," she said. "The boy I see today is healthy, confident, and emotionally stable. The transformation has been remarkable." Under cross-examination, Hartwell tried to suggest that Noah's improvement was simply the result of having adequate food and shelter, conditions that any responsible guardian could provide. "Doctor," she asked, "isn't it true that any stable home environment would have produced similar improvements in Noah's condition?" "Not necessarily, Doctor," Martinez replied firmly. "Physical health is one thing, but emotional healing requires more than just adequate care. It requires genuine love and commitment. Noah found that with Mr. Tate." Margaret Hastings, the elementary school principal, testified next about Noah's academic performance and social adjustment since enrolling in Cedar Bluff Elementary. "Noah is an exceptionally bright child who has integrated beautifully into our school community," she said. His teachers describe him as curious, respectful, and eager to learn. Most importantly, he talks about Mr. Tate with obvious love and gratitude. The stability of that relationship has been crucial to his success. Pete Hannigan spoke about observing the daily interactions between Judson and Noah, describing scenes of genuine affection and mutual respect that had developed over months of shared work and quiet companionship. "I've watched Judson Tate become a father again," the old rancher said simply. "And I've watched that boy bloom like a flower in good soil. That's not something you can fake or buy." But it was Dr. Ellen Reeves, the child psychologist, whose testimony provided the most compelling evidence for Noah's placement with Judson. "In my professional opinion," she said, "Noah has formed a secure attachment with Mr. Tate that is consistent with a healthy parent-child relationship." When asked about his preferences for future placement, Noah was unequivocal in his desire to remain with Mr. Tate. More significantly, when discussing Mr. Whitmore, Noah expressed genuine fear and distrust. "Fear of what?" Torres asked. "Fear of being valued only for his inheritance rather than for himself as a person." Noah is remarkably perceptive for his age, and he clearly understands the difference between someone who cares about him and someone who cares about what he represents financially. The morning session concluded with this powerful testimony, and Judge Morrison called a recess for lunch. As the courtroom emptied, Judson felt cautiously optimistic about their chances. The community support was evident, the professional testimony was strong, and Noah himself had conducted himself with remarkable dignity throughout the morning. But he also knew that Marcus Whitmore's team would present their own compelling case in the afternoon, and the ultimate decision would rest with a judge who had to balance emotional considerations against legal precedents and practical concerns. The fight for Noah's future was far from over, but as they walked to lunch surrounded by supportive community members, Judson felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the strength that comes from knowing you're not fighting alone. The afternoon session began with Marcus Whitmore taking the stand in his own defense. He presented himself as the picture of responsible family leadership, successful in business, financially stable, and genuinely concerned about his young cousin's welfare. "I've been searching for Noah since his father disappeared," Marcus testified, his voice carrying just the right note of family concern. "The Whitmore family may have had our differences with Catherine when she was alive, but Noah is our blood, and we take care of our own." Under direct examination from Catherine Hartwell, Marcus painted a compelling picture of the opportunities he could provide: private schools, college tuition, travel, and exposure to cultural experiences that would broaden Noah's horizons far beyond what a remote ranch in Utah could offer. "I understand that Noah has grown attached to Mr. Tate," Marcus continued, "and I respect the care that's been provided. But Noah deserves more than just adequate care. He deserves the advantages that his mother's inheritance was meant to provide: the best education, the finest opportunities, the security that comes from being part of a family with resources and connections." When Torres rose for cross-examination, she approached Marcus with the careful precision of a surgeon making a critical incision. "Mr. Whitmore, when exactly did you begin searching for Noah?" "Immediately after we learned of his disappearance." "And when was that?" Marcus hesitated for just a moment. "Late September. But Noah's father abandoned him in early September. Why the delay?" "These things take time to investigate properly." Torres moved to the evidence table and retrieved a document. "According to court records, you filed a motion challenging your cousin Catherine's will in Augusta, full month before Noah disappeared. Is that correct?" Marcus's composure flickered slightly. "That's a separate legal matter." "Is it? You've been trying to gain control of Catherine's estate for 3 years, haven't you? And gaining guardianship of Noah would give you access to the trust funds that support him." "I resent the implication." "It's not an implication, Mr. Whitmore. It's a direct question. Would becoming Noah's guardian give you financial control over his inheritance?" Marcus's attorney objected, but Judge Morrison overruled, instructing the witness to answer. As trustee, I would have certain fiduciary responsibilities, Marcus admitted. And trustee fees? Investment management fees? Would you benefit financially from managing Noah's assets? Standard trustee compensation is allowed by law. Torres then presented the documents that Noah's father had preserved financial records showing Marcus's mounting debts, legal bills from his challenges to Catherine's will, and most damaging of all, communications with private investigators discussing strategies for gaining custody of Noah. In this email to your attorney, Torres read, you state, if we can establish guardianship, we'll have 8 years to stabilize our financial position before the boy reaches majority. Does that sound like family concern to you, Mr. Whitmore? The courtroom was silent as Marcus struggled to explain away language that clearly revealed his true motivations. His careful facade of family responsibility was crumbling under the weight of his own documented words. But the most powerful moment came when Noah himself took the stand. Judge Morrison had arranged for him to testify in her chambers, with only the attorneys and court reporter present, to minimize the intimidation factor. However, Noah had specifically requested to testify in open court. I want everyone to hear what I have to say, he'd told Torres during their preparation. I want them to understand why I choose Judson. As Noah settled into the witness chair, adjusting the microphone so his young voice could be heard clearly, the courtroom fell completely silent. Even Marcus's attorneys seemed to recognize that this was the moment that would likely determine the case's outcome. Torres approached him gently. Noah, can you tell the court how you came to live with Mr. Tate? In a clear, steady voice, Noah recounted the story of his father's abandonment, his days of walking through unfamiliar country, and his arrival at Judson's ranch. But more importantly, he described what had happened since then, the gradual building of trust, the shared work and quiet conversations, the sense of belonging that he'd never experienced before. Judson didn't have to take me in, Noah said. He could have called the authorities or sent me away. But he chose to keep me, even though I was a stranger, and he didn't know anything about me. That's what family really means, choosing to love someone and stick with them, even when it's hard. When asked about his feelings regarding Marcus Whitmore, Noah's response was measured, but firm. I know he's related to my mother, but I don't know him. He never tried to contact us when my mother was alive, and he only started looking for me after he found out about the inheritance. That doesn't feel like family to me. Marcus's attorney tried to shake Noah's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that he'd been coached or influenced by Judson to reject his blood family. Noah, Hartwell asked, don't you think you owe it to your mother's memory to give her family a chance? My mother always told me that real family was about love, not blood, Noah replied. She said the people who truly care about you will prove it through their actions. Judson proved it. Mr. Whitmore hasn't. But Mr. Whitmore can provide you with opportunities that Mr. Tate simply cannot. Don't you want those advantages? Noah looked directly at Marcus for the first time during the proceedings, his young face serious but unafraid. I want to be with someone who sees me as more than a trust fund with legs, he said quietly. I want to be with someone who loved me before he knew I had money. The courtroom stirred at this remarkably mature response from a 10-year-old, and Judge Morrison had to gavel for quiet. When testimony concluded, both sides presented their closing arguments. Hartwell emphasized legal precedent, blood relationships, and practical considerations about Noah's material welfare. Torres spoke about love, community, and the fundamental principle that a child's best interests weren't always served by traditional family structures. Your Honor, Torres concluded, this case ultimately comes down to a simple question. What kind of family does Noah Mitchell need? He needs one built on love rather than legal obligation, on commitment rather than financial opportunity, on genuine care rather than blood relationship. He found that family when he knocked on Judson Tate's door, and the law should recognize what everyone in this courtroom can see, that sometimes the most important families are the ones we choose. As Judge Morrison announced that she would take the matter under advisement and render her decision within 24 hours, Judson felt the weight of everything that hung in the balance. a child's future, a relationship that had transformed them both, and the fundamental question of what made a family legitimate in the eyes of both law and love. Noah reached for his hand as they left the courtroom, and Judson squeezed it gently, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they had fought with courage and integrity for the bond that had grown between them. The gavel that would decide their fate would fall within hours, but the love that had brought them to this moment was already beyond the reach of any court's jurisdiction. The call came at 7 in the morning, while Judson was feeding the horses and Noah was getting ready for what might be his last day at Cedar Bluff Elementary. Rebecca Torres's voice was steady but carried an undertone of excitement that made Judson's heart race. "Judge Morrison wants everyone back in court at 9 o'clock, she said. "She's ready to render her decision." The drive to town seemed both endless and too short. Noah sat quietly in the passenger seat, turning his wooden horse over in his hands, with the kind of focused attention that had become his way of managing anxiety. They'd spent the previous evening talking about all the possible outcomes, preparing themselves for whatever the judge might decide. "No matter what happens," Judson had told him, "these months together have been the best of my life. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Noah had asked. "The ability to love someone so much that losing them would break my heart all over again. But you know what? It's worth the risk." Now, as they pulled into the courthouse parking lot, Judson felt that same mixture of terror and determination that had carried him through his most difficult army missions. The outcome was beyond his control now, but the fight itself had been worth everything they'd invested in it. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been the previous day. Word had spread throughout Cedar Bluff about the hearing's importance, and it seemed like half the town had shown up to hear Judge Morrison's decision. Pete Hannigan was there, along with Dr. Martinez, Margaret Hastings, Bob Miller, and dozens of other community members who had become invested in Noah's story. Marcus Whitmore sat with his legal team, looking confident but tense. He'd clearly expected a quick victory based on blood relationship and superior resources, and the complexity of the proceedings had obviously caught him off guard. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with the kind of measured dignity that spoke of the gravity of the decision she was about to render. As everyone rose for her entrance, Judson felt Noah's small hand slip into his, warm and trusting despite everything that hung in the balance. "Please be seated," Judge Morrison said, settling behind her bench with a thick folder of documents. "I've had the opportunity to review all testimony and evidence presented in this matter, and I'm prepared to render my decision regarding the custody of Noah Mitchell." The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of her papers rustling as she arranged her notes. "This case has required me to consider fundamental questions about the nature of family, the best interests of a child, and the proper balance between legal precedent and human compassion. I want to begin by acknowledging that both parties in this proceeding have presented legitimate arguments for Noah's placement in their care." Judson's chest tightened. The judge's measured tone gave no hint of which way she was leaning. "Mr. Whitmore has established his blood relationship to Noah and has demonstrated the financial resources to provide substantial material advantages. His concern for his young cousin appears genuine, and his desire to ensure that Noah's inheritance is properly managed has merit." Marcus straightened in his chair, clearly interpreting these comments as favorable to his case. "However," Judge Morrison continued, and that single word carried the weight of everything Judson had been hoping for, "this court's primary obligation is to determine Noah's best interests, not simply to follow the path of least legal resistance." She turned her attention to the community members filling the gallery. "I have been deeply impressed by the testimony of Noah's teachers, his doctor, and members of the Cedar Bluff community who have observed his remarkable transformation over the past 4 months. The evidence clearly establishes that Noah has thrived in Mr. Tate's care in ways that go far beyond mere physical welfare." Judge Morrison then addressed Noah directly, her voice becoming warmer and more personal. "Noah, your testimony yesterday was both courageous and insightful. Your ability to articulate your own needs and preferences, despite your young age, has been crucial to this court's deliberation. You have demonstrated remarkable maturity and wisdom in understanding the difference between someone who cares about you and someone who cares about what you represent." She paused, consulting her notes before continuing. "The evidence presented by Mr. Tate's attorney regarding Mr. Whitmore's financial motivations is deeply troubling. While I don't question Mr. Whitmore's legal right to seek guardianship, his documented statements about using Noah's trust funds to stabilize his financial position raise serious concerns about his primary motivations." Marcus's face had gone pale, and his attorneys were conferring in urgent whispers. "Most importantly," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the full authority of her office, "I have observed the genuine affection and mutual respect between Noah and Mr. Tate. This relationship has clearly provided Noah with the stability, security, and love that every child deserves. Blood relationships are important, but they do not automatically create the emotional bonds that are essential to a child's healthy development." She looked directly at Judson and Noah, and for the first time, her formal demeanor softened into something approaching warmth. "Therefore, it is the decision of this court that Noah Mitchell shall remain in the custody of Judson Tate, who is hereby appointed as his legal guardian. Furthermore, I am ordering that Mr. Tate be granted the authority to pursue formal adoption proceedings, should he choose to do so." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as the community members who had supported their cause celebrated the victory. Noah turned to Judson with tears streaming down his face, and Judson pulled him into a fierce embrace, feeling years of grief and loneliness finally beginning to heal. "We did it," Noah whispered against his shoulder. "We really did it." "No," Judson replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You fought for us when it would have been easier to just go along with what the adults decided." Judge Morrison gavelled for order and continued with the practical details of her ruling. Marcus Whitmore would retain no parental rights or authority over Noah's welfare, though the boy's inheritance would be managed by an independent trustee until he reached majority age. Any attempts to challenge the custody arrangement would face a high legal bar, given the court's finding that Noah's best interests were clearly served by his placement with Judson. As they left the courthouse an hour later, surrounded by friends and neighbors offering congratulations and support, Judson felt as though he was seeing the world with new eyes. The same mesa landscape that had seemed so desolate during his years of grief now looked filled with possibility and hope. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Noah asked the question that had been on both their minds. "What happens now?" "Now we become a real family," Judson replied. "Legally, officially, permanently, if you want that." "I've wanted it since the first night I slept in your house," Noah said simply. "I just didn't dare hope it could really happen." 6 months later, on a warm day in June, Judge Morrison performed one final legal ceremony in her chambers. With Pete Hannigan and Dr. Martinez serving as witnesses, she signed the papers that made Noah Mitchell Tate officially and permanently Judson's son. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came that evening, when Judson presented Noah with a gift that represented everything their journey together had meant. It was a new family photograph, the two of them standing on the porch of the ranch, surrounded by the vast beauty of Cedar Mesa. But beside it, in a matching frame, was the old burned photograph he'd kept hidden for so many years. Emma, Tommy, and his younger self, their faces still smiling through the smoke damage. "They're part of our family too," Judson explained as Noah studied both photographs. "Love doesn't replace love, son. It just makes room for more." That night, as Noah read aloud from one of the books that had once belonged to Tommy, Judson reflected on the mysterious ways that healing could come to a broken heart. He'd thought his capacity for love had died with his first family, but this brave, resilient boy had taught him that the human heart was far more resilient than he'd ever imagined. Sometimes the family we need most does indeed walk up to our door when we least expect it. And sometimes, if we're wise enough and brave enough to open that door, we discover that love has the power to rebuild what we thought was lost forever.